You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis. And Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we are joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, a regular on Diasporic Music and a regular on many shows. And Dr. Horne is, well, he can tell you where he is, but his brand new book is Armed Struggle. Great book about, I should say, armed struggle with a question mark. And it is about the Black Panthers and the Communist Party and other forces in the Los Angeles area. How are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm here in London doing research on various book projects. I should also mention breaking news, which is that Mr. Biden has thrown in the towel. He's dropped out of the race for nomination of the Democratic Party to run for president. He's endorsed his Vice President Harris, for that nomination. It's not a done deal, nor a foregone conclusion that she will emerge triumphant at the Democratic Party convention in Chicago in a few weeks. Who will be her running mate if she does emerge triumphant, you ask? I would suggest Governor Cooper of North Carolina, not least because it's a hotly contested swing state. In that regard, given the bigotry and bias in the United States, I would tend to rule out Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, another swing state, because he happens to be Jewish in this country that's leaning towards Christian nationalism. And in that regard, probably ruled out would be Governor Pritzker of Illinois. However, Governor Pritzker of Illinois has the advantage in U.S. politics of being a billionaire, which means he could self-finance a race, which also means that you cannot rule him out as a nominee for president at the Chicago convention.
That is, Vice President Harris is going to have. Also, it's a possibility that she might not win she might not be triumphant. I guess that's an understatement, right?
That is an understatement.
So since we were talking about the Democratic convention, why don't we talk about the past Trump triumph into the nominee?
Well, as you probably know, there was an apparent assassination attempt directed at Mr. Trump about 8 days ago in Butler, Pennsylvania. The purported gunman was killed instantaneously. Mr. Trump appeared at the Republican convention in Milwaukee with a bandage on his ear. Apparently, he was wounded by an errant bullet. What's striking about Mr. Trump was that he spoke for 92 minutes a day or two ago, accepting the nomination. And it was typical Trump. He was wandering all over the place. Perhaps with Mr. Biden dropping out, there will be a refocus on the apparent mental debilities of one Donald J. Trump, which in some sense he helped to compensate for by putting forward JD Vance, a junior senator from Ohio, as his vice presidential running mate. Mr. Vance, as you probably know, is only 39 years old, half the age of the elderly Mr. Trump. JD Vance has quite a biography. In some sense, he is the perfect candidate for late settler colonialism leaning towards fascism. Speaking of the United States of America, he was catapulted into prominence after he penned a memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which was turned into a motion picture And what's striking about the memoir is that he blames the ills of capitalism not on the structures of capitalism, but on individual weaknesses of those who are afflicted by these ills. In some ways, he's reminiscent of the late grand philosopher Sly Stone, who in a notorious lyric remarked, "Don't blame your neighborhood, you're the one." In other words, if you have problems, don't blame your environment, blame yourself. And that makes Mr. JD Vance a perfect candidate, not only for the Republican Party, but for a country leaning towards fascism. Mr. Vance is also an opportunist. The newspapers are full of his prior condemnations of Mr. Trump, calling him everything from Hitler to cultural heroin. But now you only hear high praise of Mr. Trump from JD Vance. Mr. JD Vance has been funded handsomely by Silicon Valley billionaires. And in that regard, note that Elon Musk of apartheid South Africa ancestry has pledged to give $45 million a month until the election in November to the Trump-Vance team. Mr. Vance himself was funded by Mr. Musk's comrade, speaking of Peter Thiel, whose roots are in South African occupied Namibia before independence in 1990. And that, I think, also reflects the fact that in his acceptance speech, Mr. J.D. Vance was quite hostile towards not only the foreign wars that the United States has been involved in, Iraq in the first instance. He was quite hostile to what he called elites. And he was also critical of Wall Street. Now, he was not critical of Silicon Valley. And so one of the things we're going to have to watch are the apparent rifts in the US ruling class between the finance capitalists of Wall Street and the tech billionaires, the tech bros of Silicon Valley. That's something to watch. Mr. J.D. Vance is also anti-immigrant, violently so, even though his in-laws have roots in India. Of course, his wife is of South Asian ancestry. And in some ways, she is a perfect complement for Mr. J.D. Vance, and so far as she served as a law clerk for both right-wing Supreme Court Judge Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Chief Justice John Roberts. Mr. J.D. Vance is also anti-choice, even in cases of rape and incest. He is hostile to abortion, and I can think of no more emblem appropriate for settler colonialism as it leans towards fascism is that particular position. J.D. Vance also represents a beau ideal of settler colonialism leaning towards fascism, insofar as his is a story of not rising with the working class. He, of course, is from a working class family in Ohio, but rising from the working class. He is a class traitor. He is a class collaborationist. Class collaborationism, as you know, has been at the heart of settler colonialism going back to its origins centuries ago. And I'm afraid to say that the Republican convention in Milwaukee just this past week, his was not the only presentation reeking of class collaborationism. I'm thinking of the remarks by the president of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien. The Teamsters routinely bills itself as one of the largest unions in the capitalist world. He was high in his praise for Mr. Trump, speaking of Sean O'Brien. And so this particular race that's shaping up if one presumes that Vice President Harris will become the Democratic Party nominee, it'll be interesting to see how she fares with regard to her debates with Mr. Trump, although it won't take much to beat Mr. Biden's abysmal performance on June 27, 2024, where he was painfully incoherent. However, it's not a done deal, I would say, that either Mr. Trump will prevail or that Vice President Harris will prevail. In other words, U.S. imperialism is about to enter not only uncharted waters, but rocky waters.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with, we're speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne. Could I ask you this question, Dr. Horne? Don't you think it's a problem when some of our nationalist, skin nationalist folks basically don't make a distinction between the Wall Street and Silicon Valley? Isn't there a problem when we look at when we won't exploit the contradictions between our enemies? Could you talk about that?
Well, this reminds me, I gave a presentation the other day where I made remarks that I thought were well known. That is to say, in the UK, where I'm now sitting, there is mass antipathy towards Germany. They fought 2 world wars in the 20th century. During the Second World War, people were sleeping in subways because the Germans were bombing the cities, for example. And I think what happens is that this whole whiteness project, whereby when Europeans cross the ocean, they rebrand themselves as white, and those who had been at each other's throats, Catholics and Protestants, British and German, all of a sudden they join hands so that they can loot the indigenous and enslave the Africans. And I think that some of our Black American friends, or Black friends in general in North America, they're so taken by that latter process that they refuse to accept that perhaps in Europe, things were not working out that way. And that has the added advantage, to a certain degree, of keeping them from getting involved in struggles, because when you're detached from reality, well, why should you struggle? I mean, you might as well go to the beach and get high. So once again, I think that many of us are about to pay a stiff price because of ignoring reality and ignoring history and basically being taken by theories that do not hold water.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. Were you finished, Dr. Horne?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought there was something wrong. Go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, let's keep it moving and move it to the ICJ ruling.
Yeah, so the International Court of Justice, in an opinion from their perch in The Hague, has ruled that there is something improper and illegal about Israeli settlements in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Of course, enforcing that opinion will be more than a notion. Mr. Netanyahu has rejected, and by the way, he'll be in Washington this coming week, and there's going to be an attempt to effectuate a citizen's arrest against Mr. Netanyahu so that he can be bundled off to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court, to stand trial and to face the music, to face justice. Actually, I had contemplated that Mr. Biden would not resign, or I should say drop out from his nomination to be U.S. president. He has not resigned as president thus far. And I would be very surprised if he did, although he may. I thought that he would want to face Mr. Netanyahu face to face while still in the race, but apparently that's not the case. Israel is going through tough times nowadays. You know that the Yemeni forces bombed Tel Aviv just a few days ago. The Israelis retaliated by bombing Yemen. This is not the end of the story. Israel is coming apart at the seams, and his trip, speaking of Mr. Netanyahu's trip to Washington, I do not think will alleviate that crisis, although the Zionist lobby has a veritably perfect record in terms of defeating politicians who they object to. I'm thinking of Jamal Bowman, the Congressional Black Caucus member from Bronx Westchester, defeated in the primary. There are other members of the Black Caucus that are up for defeat as well. So once again, the United States is encountering rocky waters and uncharted waters.
Let me say this, Dr. Horne, that Black Power 96 Radio is 100% funded through donations from listeners and supportive businesses in our community, and you power Black Power 96. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Horne, why should people donate to Diasporic music in particular and Black Power 96 in general?
Well, obviously, Diasporic music probably has the hippest music mix in North America, this side of KPFK Los Angeles' Freedom Now, by the way. And
Yeah.
That alone makes the donations worthwhile. And not to mention the political commentary. It's no accident that many of the cable news networks are losing audience share because what they say is utterly predictable, oftentimes wrong-headed. And you can say the exact opposite for the political commentary you hear on Black Power 96. And that's why Diasporic music and Black Power 96 receive my full-throated endorsement.
We wanted to say the Black Power 96 goal is to raise $10,000 in donations, and that we are 51% to that goal. So we would like for you guys, someone with a big check, and just write a check for $5,000. We can all go to the beach. If you're in California, you can go to Santa Monica. But Dr. Horne, you're the beach situation in England. I guess it's pretty bad, right?
Well, not really. I mean, there are beaches in England, and of course, the weather's been very warm this week, extraordinarily so. And we're expecting more of the same. And I should also say that I've been doing research at the National Archives of the UK, which, contrary to quite a bit of what occurs in this country, it's really quite efficient. I can get more work done at the National Archives of the UK in a day than I can get done at its counterpart in Washington, D.C. in a week. And so I recommend the National Archives of the UK. I mean, particularly, history of the Caribbean, history of Africa, history of Asia. I mean, it's quite remarkable what you can find here. I mean, to give you one example, I'm doing this book on slavery in Washington, D.C. And of course, I have to look at Maryland in particular, since there is a border between Maryland and Washington. There is a body of water that separates Virginia from Washington. And so what happens is that the racists in Maryland were seeking to deport all the free Negroes from Baltimore and from Maryland to West Africa. And they set up a colony adjacent, although distinct from Liberia. But on the one hand, they asked to be annexed by Liberia because they were settlers and the indigenous Africans were not necessarily welcoming to them. But on the other hand, after they were annexed, Liberia, which I have to say, until I did this research, I'd sort of dismissed as sort of a neo-colonial appendage. The Liberians were, the regime, at least in the 1850s, was quite active on the abolitionist front. They had an embassy in London. They were negotiating with the Spanish, with the Dutch. They had consulates in Liverpool and elsewhere. All of this, of course, I uncovered while doing research here in London at the National Archives, and it will transform the story that I eventually tell.
I'll say this and then we'll move on, but I remember Oprah always claimed to be a Zulu, and when she received her DNA results, it was discovered that she essentially was, her roots were from Liberia. And you can continue, Melinda.
Yeah, we're running down the list. Let's go to China and the CP Plenum.
So every few years, the Communist Party of China holds a plenum and they plot economic moves. And one of the issues at this plenum was whether or not they would continue their investment-heavy program, investing in green energy, lunar exploration, quantum computing, or whether they would lean towards more consumer stimulus, for example, to stimulate the economy further. Apparently, they split the difference and are going to pursue both. But one of my takeaways from this Communist Party plenum is that given the fact that China's economic growth rates far surpass that of any in the capitalist world, I'm beginning to suspect that the government-controlled economy in China, although of course there is a hefty private sector, but the commanding heights of the economy in China are controlled by the government and by inference by the Communist Party. And I'm beginning to suspect that that particular model is having influence in the capitalist world. You see that in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act under Mr. Biden, which directs government tax dollars to green energy, directs government tax dollars to microchips, et cetera. You see the same thing under Sir Keir Starmer in London with the proposals he just made this past week to King Charles. So in some ways, just as in the early post-Cold War environment, I'm speaking of the 1990s going forward, that there seemed to be an apparent triumph of the capitalist free market and a denigration of the role of the state in directing the economy. Once again, I'm beginning to suspect that that era is in the process of being eclipsed, and we're in a new era of a more pronounced role for the government, which makes these upcoming elections ever more important.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with we're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Diasporic Music has raised, our goal is to raise $500 and to bring our station closer to its overall goal of $10,000. And Diasporic Music, we have raised $335 towards that goal. And we would like to thank a few people. We would like to thank Ryan in New York. We would like to thank Robert in Philadelphia. We would like to thank Leah in Minnesota and Lisa in Minnesota. And you have some more questions, Mali Docuvixen.
Yeah. You're in UK. Let's talk about UK and the Labour Party.
Well, as you know, they won 33% of the vote, but with official electoral rigging, they won 65% of the seats. The Tories were routed, and Rishi Sunak was shown the door. Interestingly enough, Jeremy Corbyn, who had been the Labour Party leader before Sir Keir Starmer, won as an independent, so he'll be back in Parliament. He was treated quite shabbily by the Labour Party, which purged him under spurious and specious grounds that he was somehow anti-Jewish. Actually, he was pro-Palestinian, which of course brings us across the channel. I don't think we've talked since the triumph of the New Popular Front in the French parliamentary elections. That is to say, the communist, socialist Greens and France Unbowed, led by the former Trotskyist Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Thus far, however, they have been prevented from electing a leader of the assembly. Apparently, their choice for prime minister will not be selected either. So there's a battle royal unfolding in France. But one of the takeaways we should consider is, why is it that we oftentimes talk blithely about a so-called age of revolution, uniting 1776 and 1789 with the French Revolution, and yet in France you have communist, socialist, Greens et al. Prevailing in recent elections, whereas communist, socialist, Greens in this so-called revolutionary republic south of Canada barely can get the time of day.
Do we want to continue with the NATO 76th anniversary?
Another disaster. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has decided to ignore geography and its own name by focusing heavily on the People's Republic of China. And that, of course, brings us to a major difference between the two political parties of capital in the United States. The Republicans would like to cut a deal with Russia and focus like a laser beam on China. The Democratic strategy is to weaken Russia, perceived as China's firewall, as a step towards tangling with the Communist Party in China. Part of the problem for the Black community is that it votes routinely, perhaps understandably, against the party of fascism, speaking of the Republican Party. But like poor chess players, they have not thought a move ahead and recognize that the party they're voting for, the Democratic Party, is the party of foreign military intervention, as witnessed by this escapade in Ukraine, as witnessed by the genocidal war pursued by Democratic President Truman in Korea in the 1950s, or his counterpart, the Democratic President LBJ Johnson in the 1960s in Indochina. And that particular voting strategy makes it difficult at best to effectuate a campaign of global solidarity, which has been the savior for the much beleaguered, much besieged Black community historically, going back to the bad old days of slavery and continuing through Jim Crow. Now, sadly, tragically, unfortunately, what I've just articulated to you has not dawned. And apparently, we're headed for more of the same as a direct result.
I have I guess this might be the final question, but I'm going to throw everybody a curveball. What do you think about the basketball game between South Sudan and the U.S.? And the U.S. had all the top guns, LeBron and Mr. Davis and all Steph Curry, and they won. The U.S. won by 1 point, 100 to 99. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I were to reduce that game to one figure, it would be Luol Deng, formerly of the Chicago Bulls, formerly of the LA Lakers, a former Duke University Flash, and of course with roots in South Sudan. He has been a major influence on that country. And of course, South Sudan, the men in particular, are noted for their height. You're probably familiar with Bol Bol, for example. So they are developing talent. One of the stars of that game will be enrolling in Duke at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, in a few weeks. Although I have to say that this may not be the only surprise for this U.S. team. Watch out for Canada with Jamal Murray and SGA of the Oklahoma City Thunder. Watch out for France with Victor Wembanyama. Watch out for Serbia with the Joker of the Denver Nuggets. It will not be a walk in the park or a stroll on the beach for the much ballyhooed U.S. Olympic basketball team.
So would you say that the world is catching up or has caught up with U.S. with the U.S. when it comes to athletics, with track and field? I guess the U.S. has been surpassed in this whole the sprint game is a mixed bag of not only Jamaica but Botswana and South Africa, Kenya. I mean, you got sprinters coming from all over the planet, wouldn't you say? Well,
I think that the world is catching up with imperialism across the board, not just in athletics. Reference what we just said about the role of the Communist Party in directing the economy of China. That will be a dominant trend for the 21st century. That is to say, government-directed economic development, and countries that would like to thrive and survive will inevitably follow that pattern. And so, once again, this escape from what seemed to be a sure loss, because the U.S. team was down by 16 points at one juncture, that particular game should only be a shock and surprise to those who have not been paying attention to global developments.
All right, I think that's it. We will be in contact with you next week, sir.
Okay, I have to be in touch. I may be on a flight, so I'll let you know.
All right, no problem. And thank you, Lisa Watson, for keeping everything sounding perfect. And Melinda, any parting thoughts?
Well, if you haven't donated today, please go to blackpower96.org/donate, and we'll see everybody.